Order, order. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Environmental Audit Committee, where we have a session today on natural capital. We have two panels. I'd like to welcome our first panellists from the left, Paul Scaping from the Investment Association, Susannah Stock from the UK Infrastructure Bank, and Scott Steedman from the British Standards Institute. I'd just ask you to each briefly introduce what your role is at the organisation which makes natural capital of relevance to you, starting with you, Paul.
Thank you, Chair. I'm Paul Scaping from the Investment Association. I'm a public policy specialist. My focus is on climate and nature policy. The Investment Association is the trade body for the UK-based investment management industry. Our members manage nearly £9 trillion on behalf of individual savers, UK pension funds, insurance companies. And our interest in nature is both as an asset class but also as a risk and opportunity factor for the investments that we make.
Thank you. Susannah.
Hi, I'm Susannah Stock, a banking director at the UK Infrastructure Bank, focusing on natural capital. I'm delighted to be here today, and we hope our insight on the UK nature market is helpful for the inquiry. So the bank is wholly owned by government, with HMT as our sole shareholder, also providing us with our $22 billion of capitalisation. Our core sectors are clean energy, transport, digital, water and waste. However, nature-based solutions is explicitly defined in our Act, and as such, we approach the market from the viewpoint of nature as an infrastructure asset class, drawing upon learnings from other sectors. I'm happy to provide you with more information on the bank should you wish.
Thank you very much. Scott.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'm Scott Steedman, Director General Standards at BSI. We are a Royal Charter organisation. We are appointed by government as the national standards body, so I am responsible for all British standards used across the UK and for our membership of the European system and the international system in ISO and IEC. I'm responsible for about 1,200 committees on practically any subject you can imagine, and our main core focus on behalf of the UK is to provide that platform for UK-based stakeholders to participate in standards development and activity, and to simplify the market structure. We have an international role with ISO and IEC and a large team of policy and standards development to support the country.
Thank you. So this inquiry is really to try and raise awareness of natural capital as an asset class, as an opportunity, but also to identify and help government ensure that both the mandatory elements that have come into being and the voluntary ones that are happening through the market have a degree of confidence. And in order to provide confidence, we have to be able to measure and monitor what is happening. And I'd like to start, if I may, perhaps with you, Scott, in relation to where has the BSI got to in establishing sets of metrics and monitoring, and how well accepted are they yet in the marketplace?
Well, we're very pleased to be progressing the Nature Investment Standards Programme with DEFRA, which we've been working towards for some time. And indeed today, March 20th, we're delighted to have published the very first of those new standards, Flex 701 it's called, which are the principles for nature markets. So our ambition is to build out that programme to create the overarching framework which will simplify the market in its operation and help to bring integrity and trust by setting out what best practices you need to employ and ultimately how those credits might be assured by the market structure. So we're on track at the moment. It's a very exciting programme. I think it's very well received. We engaged across the whole of the UK. 500 stakeholders were participating in that. And after this initial standard on the principles, the overarching structure, which we might talk about later on, we have a second standard in the mix on biodiversity, a third one on carbon markets, and behind that there will be other standards on water quality improvements, natural flood benefits, nutrient reduction in water systems, and other areas, operating schemes and guidance and community benefits, I think, is a particularly interesting one down the track. So we're in the middle of a programme. It's very exciting, and we look forward to seeing that initial principle standard land in the market today.
How long will it take to move from principles to the other more specific and detailed standards that you've been talking about?
There's a parallel with work we did for the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market, where what we tried to put in place was governance to build the overarching market structure, without which you have confusion and lack of trust. So the first structure is to put in place those principles, and then the private schemes and codes that are out there, and indeed government schemes, can then start to play into that, and we start to build a more substantive programme. It is a multi-year programme, Chair, and it will take a little more time to get all of that in place. But we will create the standards with the stakeholders as fast as they can agree them.
And we're going to come on to a lot of the detail with other colleagues' sets of questions, but does this set of metrics cover the duration of a scheme, so that the establishment is one thing, but then there is monitoring progress and seeing whether or not the objectives are being met for any individual scheme, and then that might allow for an enforcement mechanism in the event that they're not being met?
Yes, indeed. The key to this is that BSI and the standards process is not there to make a judgment about any one metric over any other metric. If one was really looking for a scientific measure, I would be ringing up our colleagues in the National Physical Laboratory, the National Metrology Institute, who carry out measurement standard development. Our role really is to create standards that will set the characteristics, the essential properties, the indicators of what a good metric looks like. So setting those into a commonly agreed standard creates a structure for the market to play into and to ensure that the metrics that they are offering or they have constructed, for example, Natural England's biodiversity net gain metric, or some of the private metrics, Plan Vivo or Credit Nature, they might look in playing into that to make sure that their scheme, their standard was complying with those properties and characteristics. So it's rather about setting the rules for the way that metrics might be developed that are agreed with all the stakeholders, and that's what's all about building scale and integrity in the process.
This is a private market, so that you're not going to be the exclusive setter of standards. There will be other standards potentially available to be adopted, presumably. But where do you sit in the marketplace for standards and metrics? I mean, for example, rating agencies producing their own different standards, or are they looking to you?
Well, I would sincerely hope that they were looking to the National Standards Body. We have a National Standards Body. We're part of the National Quality Infrastructure. We are appointed by government. We're working with government to create an overarching framework of neutral, technology-independent standards that are stakeholder-driven and based on consensus. So the idea of the national standards, the idea of British standards, is that they set a framework for the private market operators to operate within. They're not the law, but one would hope that departments and regulators would encourage their use, and there are various ways to do that. Nothing stops other parties developing standards or codes as they wish. It's a free market in that sense. But our ambition on behalf of the UK is to play into the international space. This Flex 701 that's been published today is the first standard of its kind anywhere in the world. We are the member, BSI is the UK member of ISO, the International Standards Organisation. I sit on the board of ISO, and we can take what we do in the UK to the world and create the international standard, which is then adopted in other countries around the world as their national standard. So, as I said in my introduction, I'm responsible for the national standards in the United Kingdom. That doesn't stop private operators developing something they want to describe as a standard and using it in the market. But it's a different animal.
That's very encouraging. Thank you. Paul, can I just turn to you then in relation to your members who at the moment don't have an agreed set of standards to work to, well, until today didn't have the principles and now will. How well advanced is this market within your membership in the absence of a set of standards to measure by?
First of all, hopefully you'll forgive me, Chair, that I saw the publication this morning at 10:30 and I have downloaded
Not asking you to comment.
but haven't yet managed to consult
standard.
my membership on it. But I think it's worth touching on the reason the standard is being produced, and the reason it is the first standard is because this is not an advanced or developed market at the moment. We have members who are investing in this sector, in this asset class, but it is by no stretch of the imagination an established and large asset class. I mentioned in my written evidence that I think there are the commercial transactions in forestry in the UK every year of about £200 million, just under that. that's not it's a lot of money to most of us, but it's not a substantial amount of money when it comes into the amount and the context of the funds that our members manage.
You have an estimate of how much is invested in natural capital by your members?
Not overall. I do. There was a statement in my written evidence, an assessment by an independent body that it was a small scale, but no, we don't have an overall number for natural capital investment. No, it's not something that's currently measured.
Do you have a view yet as to how large the market might grow once it matures?
I think it depends frankly, on how you conceive it. If we start to talk about the concept of ecosystem as a source of economic benefits, it could be enormous, but we're talking, frankly, over the course of decades. If we start to conceive of how the economy operates in a different way, then certainly I think we could move to a stage where it is seen to be a much more substantial economic asset for the UK.
Thank you. And Susannah, do you, at the Infrastructure Bank, yet have any natural capital projects that you're either have concluded or are working on at the moment, and how do you see the standards setting as facilitating the development of your organisation's interest in this area?
Sure. So we've been invested in 2 transactions to date. Highlands Rewilding, which was an acquisition, so a bridging loan for an acquisition of some land at the estate. A second investment we actually just announced this morning, it signed on Monday. So that is an investment in a fund which is looking to upscale technologies which address some of the data issues in the market. So really looking to prove some of the technologies which measure, monitor and verify some of the metrics and also the services to the industry to help it grow.
Is that a fund that you're managing or that an external?
No, it is managed by Greensphere Capital, but our commitment is 50 million to the fund. It will be match funded by private capital on a pound for pound basis.
Very good. That's great. Thank you.
Of course, the metrics become kind of superfluous if you don't have a proper baseline.
Yeah.
So effective measurement of the starting point of any project. Paul, can I start with you and say, how do your members see the development of baselining? Where have we got to in terms of thinking through how you do it?
I don't know if you're familiar with a program called the Biodiversity Intactness Index, which is something that has been run by the Natural History Museum. I'm sure if the Natural History Museum were here, they'd tell me a whole bunch of other people were involved as well, but I've come to it through them. I know that a couple of our members use that index to measure projects that they're running, again, in the UK. And the concept of the Biodiversity Intactness Index is that it attributes a sort of a percentage score to a particular area on the basis of how intact the biodiversity is in that area against how you would expect it to be if there had been no human interaction at all. So when we talk in terms of climate change, we think about pre-industrial levels. Here we're talking almost pre-human levels. And the way they manage to come up with that baseline is that they identify areas which have had no human interaction and they infer from that what biodiversity intactness should be elsewhere. Just to give you an indication, for the UK as a whole, it has a biodiversity intactness score of 52%, I think.
How are they measuring, though, the current state?
So and again, it might be worth getting the detail from the Natural History Museum, but they have 5 million data points that they say they have there. So I think it is an observed situation. They look at the current situation, what's there. But the Natural History Museum and its partners have a huge data set in terms of every understanding of living.
Are they using DNA-based testing as part of that baselining?
That's I'm not aware of.
Dr. Steedman, you're looking at the kind of ongoing metrics, but are you looking at baselining as well? And if so, where have you got to? And I think also, is there a case in your view for a registration system for baselining?
Well, Yes, the standard we've just launched today, the overarching principles, includes very clear requirements about the importance of baselining and the importance of doing it in a scientifically measurable way, and the vital requirement that improvements mustn't be a reversal of historic damaging actions. So you can't just get rewarded for damaging the environment and then putting it back. And the second and third pieces of work, the biodiversity and carbon markets, will go further, and they'll set out best practice in how you will develop a baseline. So we have that in process, and those standards will be available for use by the entire market. So I would hope that this example that Paul has given, that they would then say, well, are we following these principles? Can we demonstrate that we are using those principles in the baseline measurement that we are undertaking?
Ms. Stock, when you invested in the project you referred to, what did you do to assess the baseline?
Sure. So in Highlands Rewilding, there was no baseline at the point that we invested, and the reason for that is that the form of loan was different. It's a bridging loan as opposed to a long-dated loan against natural capital revenue streams. But we do see the baseline as incredibly important, and the reason for that is investors, they need to make investment decisions relatively quickly, sometimes in a few months. So if you don't have a readily accessible baseline data set, you can't make those decisions quickly enough. And if you're thinking about the way revenues are generated on a natural capital asset, they will be based on what you plan to do in terms of habitat creation. Carbon is somewhat easier, but biodiversity and water quality are impacted by seasonality. Yep. So you need to really check that your baseline data is accurate. So ideally, we'd like to see a sort of a tool that we can use to estimate baseline and then confirm that, over the years post investment. So I think that's quite important. I think because the baseline is so important, and it's the measurement of the metric against the baseline value, which then drives returns, you need to make sure it's done correctly, because if it's not, then that investor is going to lose confidence in the market. And I think just the final point is that what the baseline does allow you to do is then further refine what you're going to put on that site once you've got the detailed data, if you like.
Yeah. Any of you, how can the allocated value of a natural capital asset account for existing and future potential provision of services that could arise with further investment?
Well, what's critical here is that you have transparency of what's gone before, and that you avoid double counting, so that you are very careful to retire credits that are not being, they're going to be replaced by some new development. But again, it's all about setting out best practice, and I think transparency is incredibly important, so that everybody can see what's going on. I don't have a better answer.
A last question for me for Paul Scaping is the focus. A lot of what we hear is on stuff within the United Kingdom, but this is going to be a global marketplace.
Yeah.
And the standards we set for baselining could logically be used to build the reputation of the United Kingdom as a place to do business in natural capital. Yeah. How do you see the potential, and what needs to happen to effectively take us from a kind of UK-focused approach to being, frankly, strengthening London's position as being a major centre in the global natural capital market?
I absolutely agree, and I'm glad you asked the question as well, because it's a challenge at the moment, and it's a challenge as much as I commend Scott and his team for the work. Our members manage half of what they manage is for clients overseas, and comparably they also invest overseas. If you would, and hopefully we'll get on to questions around the task force for nature-related financial disclosures later, which I think is relevant. But if you look at the state and the nature of the UK stock market, we have tobacco companies, mining companies, banks who operate globally. If you are looking to assess a forestry project in the UK using UK standards and perhaps working with the UK Infrastructure Bank, at the moment all of these standards will really help with the reputation of the UK and with the credibility of those projects. But there will be a need, as Scott said, I think, first off, for these things to be sort of elevated in terms of the international standard setting community, if I can call it that. I think that, it will be important for the international organisation to adopt these standards. I also think there is a role for the UK government, for other organisations, I'm sure the UK Infrastructure Bank with its peers, to promote these ideas. And as I mentioned, the Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosures, that's another example of a project which has been partly funded by the UK government, has been supported by the UK government. And now we're at a bit of a crossroads where it's about encouraging people to adopt it. And I think the UK can work through bodies like the G20, among others, to make sure that major economies pick up these standards.
May I just add to that a little bit? I mean, I think this market is a couple of years behind the carbon market, and even that is struggling to take off. But the opportunity here to scale globally based on UK standards, the standards I've described are international standards. Nothing, you can use them globally. There's nothing wrong with that. But what is key to scale is the assurance side. So that the standards are written in such a way that you can have independent assurance, third-party certification, using an existing accredited market for certification, which exists all over the world today. If you don't, you'll never get scale. If you do, you can unlock that tool that is sitting in every country through the accreditation structures to actually audit and verify and validate individual projects. So the key to international standards is creating standards that are not only recognised and used, but actually are able to be unlocked by the assurance sector.
Thank you, Chris. I think Clive Lewis had a very quick supplementary.
Just one of the, thank you, Chair. Paul, you mentioned a 52% figure for the UK. Do you have any other comparative figures for other parts of the world, just to see where we... Because 52% sounds okay, I suppose. It's more than half. Is that...
It's not okay.
I think it was, but it could be. You could be forgiven for thinking people that. I just wondered what comparatively.
So I know that the scope is I think a frame between 30% where you are on the precipice of collapse. 90% is considered to be good. I think a lot of other advanced economies would be closer to that 90% figure. I understand by comparison. I think Singapore, if I'm correct, is not far above 30%. But as I understand it, the UK is quite a poor shape compared to other countries.
Thank you. Barry Gardner.
Thank you, Chair. Dr. Steedman, you cannot imagine how excited I am by the work that you're doing. The progress that's been made in the past 20 years on this has been quite phenomenal, and I think it's really important the way in which you're endeavouring to set out those standards. I want to try and just tease out or outline the components within the institution's programme and how it's been developed. But before I do that, I just wanted to pick up on the question that my colleague Chris Grayling asked you, because I wasn't sure that you gave an answer to the question which I think he was asking. And that was, in effect, how can the allocated value of natural capital asset account for the hope value, in effect?
Yes.
So you can say, well, reinstate this and it has this value, but actually once you've reinstated this, the potential for reinstating other things on top of that is in some cases exponential. And so are you accounting for any hope value, if I can express it in that rather residential housing term?
Yes. I'm not sure that I've seen that in the work to date, but it's a very interesting thought, isn't it? The difficulty perhaps is that it may never happen. So I suppose the argument is that you would create the standard, the principles in the standard would include the concept of a hope value, and that should be demonstrated in some way. And in a measurable way that could be then valued. But I'm not sure that at the moment the principles that are set out in the overarching umbrella standard are covering that. They could be more relevant in specific areas like natural flood or something like that, where you've got a particular example. My background was a little bit to do with flooding, where you can imagine a situation that, I'm in a floodplain, this is going to happen, and then I can see the hope opportunity. But setting it at the very high level might be quite vague, except as a general concept. Okay, so perhaps it's for the more specific areas when we get into biodiversity, carbon, natural flood, and so on. Thank you.
Thanks for that. Look, You mentioned when you were talking with the chair, I think the phrase used was, we need to drive out the lack of trust. And I think, Ms. Stock, you also said something very similar. And there are a lot of different confusing codes out there, different schemes, private initiatives. So how much about this is driving out greenwash, giving absolute clarity to how the markets ought to operate, and therefore giving real security to the investors?
Well, from my perspective, it is absolutely the number one parameter. It is critical. And the difficulty is that in new and emerging markets, there's a void, there's a vacuum. And passionate and skillful and knowledgeable people rush into the vacuum and create standards and codes. And suddenly there's a plethora of ideas, and everybody's saying, oh, well, this is better than that. And the fact is, they're not standards. They don't have governance. They don't have stakeholder engagement. They don't have process. BSI doesn't set standards. What we do is run a process for stakeholders to participate, and we see fair play and make sure that everybody's voice is heard and that consensus is reached. And then we manage and maintain and update and revise those standards and make them international in a neutral and technology agnostic way. So this is very, very common, and it happened also in the carbon markets. Lots of schemes developed suddenly, but they're schemes, they're not standards. So they use the word because it's very common.
So can you talk a bit more about how the process that you're using to engage with those stakeholders and to I suppose it's really rather like corralling sheep and getting them all moving in the same direction. How are you going about doing that, and how wide is the ambit of the people that you're engaging with?
In any of these topics, we will engage as broadly as we can. We will use, if it's a government initiative, we'll use government contacts. We use our own contacts. We use industry contacts. We'll ask them who should be involved. We'll build a stakeholder base. We'll have a town hall type of environment. We'll try to make sure that group is as diverse as possible. Speed matters. So if we're trying to do something really fast and agile, which we have a process called Flex to deliver in a matter of weeks, you can't engage with everybody in that time frame, but you can engage with a sufficiently representative cohort. So as I said earlier, we engaged in this principles piece of work, the top level piece of work, with 500 stakeholders across all the devolved nations, representing all parts of the industry. And others are very welcome to join. We will build on that group over time. If we mature that into a formal British standard, then we will have our own set processes with 3 months of public consultation and formal representation and committee structures who will maintain that in perpetuity. So it is very much a process-driven, stakeholder-led activity. Engaging with the widest possible community is what we're here to do. My team are there to run the process. And anybody is welcome to email me and say, how do I get involved in this?
Great. There are interactions between ecosystems and their services and overlapping boundaries. What approach are you taking so that the standards that you develop will account for those overlaps?
Well, the key here is to make sure we've got the right stakeholders in the room. So not just the landowners and farmers, not just the regulators, but actually you have the people from the adjacent walks of life. So in the carbon area, we've engaged very heavily with DESNES, with the department, and with the ICVCM on the voluntary carbon market to make sure that the standards that they're using and their approaches are embedded. People are using the same taxonomy, so the basic structures are all in place. And it's all around streamlining and simplifying the market at an overarching structure. So sitting in what we call the quality infrastructure between the department, regulators, legislation, and the market practices, sitting in there creating that rules-based system that is voluntary, but hopefully creates clarity and transparency for everybody. So the key to that is to involving the stakeholders from those adjacent areas in the work, and we make a big effort to do that.
Thank you. Are you hopeful that along with the development of a comprehensive set of standards, it may be possible to achieve at government level an allocation of natural capital in the same way as currently one would have the Chief Secretary give an allocation of financial resource to departments, but somebody in government would then be able to look at a department's program and say, no, look here, you're proposing to do this, and we can see why on the conventional terms the Treasury might allow it, but in natural capital terms you are violating certain of these standards. So that we have in effect a Chief Secretary for natural capital in the same way as we have for resource.
I would sincerely hope so. I think that challenges we've had in other sectors over the last decades have been because we haven't had this conversation. We haven't realised this extraordinary tool that we have, that actually we're world leaders in, how to shape national and international standards that are stakeholder-led, that can work very closely with departmental priorities, with the delivery of regulatory policy, with ministerial priorities, and simply by engaging. And there are various nuanced ways in which standards can be used with regulation to deliver effect. They don't have to be regulated. In fact, we would strongly advise against that. But there are ways that you can encourage their use, you can co-regulate, you can use earned recognition, lots of tools by which a department can engage with standards at any level. The key to this is the provenance of the standard, the fact that it has governance, it has stakeholder engagement, it has proper structures behind it. Then it has the reliability of being able to be used by government in a formal way.
And so is that something that you think this committee should be highlighting to government, the potential use of the standards in decision-making at that highest level?
I think absolutely we should. This is quite normal, quite common in other departments. Department of Business and Trade, for example, will use standards in exactly that way. And I'm delighted that we've been working with DEFRA for some years now to try and suggest that a lot of the structures within DEFRA could benefit from engaging with the national standards system and building that in as a layer of support for their ambitions.
Well, thank you very much. It's taken me 16 years to get somebody to say that in front of a committee, so I'm delighted.
Thank you, Barry. Karen Lucas.
Thank you, Chair. I have to say that I have rather more reservations about this whole approach than perhaps my esteemed colleague on the opposite side of the table. But I would certainly agree that if you are going to have such a market-based approach, then it needs to be strongly regulated and standards need to be transparent and we need the kind of the monitoring and evaluation and so forth that is being spoken of. But my first question really, maybe start with Paul and go along, would be about how can additionality be verified and managed in natural capital investments? How do we know that some kind of improvement wouldn't have happened anyway, even if we hadn't have had the investment that we're talking about?
So I think maybe as a first suggestion, I think something we're slightly lacking at the moment, actually, if I may say so, is a sense of what's trying to be achieved. We have. That
sounds quite a big omission.
Yeah, well, let me try and explain it. So, if I may just for a moment compare it to climate change and the whole infrastructure we have around the UNFCCC, the Climate Change Act, and that whole system. If you were to ask someone what was trying to be achieved, I think people would generally understand that you are looking to reduce temperatures to a certain level, that in order to do so you're looking to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and you have this target and you're looking to be net zero. With the Global Biodiversity Framework, there's I think 23 sections, there's various sort of subsectors of that. The UK government has its own Environment Act targets, which are similar but not the same. So we talk often about additionality when it comes to removing carbon, and that's quite almost a straightforward thing to do. You can ask about that. I think what you need to understand, if you have a hectare of land and it is performing a particular ecosystem service, is what it is that you're looking for it to achieve, and then you can start to assess whether a particular service would have been delivered anyway. I think given the state of UK natural capital and the environment, I think you can probably safely assume that you're not going to have sort of rainforests just blooming in the middle of Sussex without any encouragement. But in terms of the measurable impacts of particular, more gradual change, I think you first need to have a better structure for what it is you're trying to assess.
How would that process happen? How would we get that better structure as a starting point?
As a starting point, I think we need, and maybe this goes to Mr. Grayling's question a little as well, I think some UK leadership in terms of actually encouraging support for and incorporation of the Global Biodiversity Framework targets internationally, maybe creating a bit of a sense of a transition around a few of those areas. So perhaps we want to have a transition for water security so people can more clearly identify with that.
Do you think there are risks about going ahead with this before we've actually established what we're trying to achieve?
In the grand scheme of things, of course, there are always risks involved. I think it is better that people are making an effort to try to improve the natural environment regardless. There are perhaps...
That assumes that there wouldn't be other ways of doing it, though. I mean, I suppose my question to you is this market-based, market-led approach to seeking to protect the natural environment the best way of doing it before we have actually established something as basic as what are we actually trying to do here?
No, I don't think it's necessarily the Investment Association's position that we, it may surprise you, but that we think that absolutely must be a market-led approach. Investors very much believe in the power of government to deal with tricky situations, high-risk situations, and to help lead on things. That helps to create an environment in which sometimes the market can follow as well.
Would your organisation support, for example, publicly accessible registries of who is buying what and who owns them?
Yes, I think so. I think transparency is a good for its own sake, quite often. What I would point out, and I know this was discussed at a previous session, and it was suggested that having a sense of whether credible organisations are investing in something can sometimes help to raise the reputation or the standing of that particular investment. As organisations that invest in companies, sometimes it's quite useful to realise if a company perhaps is using a significant amount of offsets. That might indicate, for example, that they're not dealing with underlying problems. So that's useful for investors. What I would also say, though, is I don't think that policymakers should be afraid of asking for disclosure for their own policy-making sense. Not always to think that a disclosure has to go in financial report and accounts and be a factor for investors to look at. If MPs are interested in understanding where investment is taking place, then I think an approach to transparency that suits policy-making needs is also respectable. I haven't sort of studied a proposal for particularly what a registry would look like, but I think in principle, transparency
in order to have confidence, one could suggest that maybe having such a registry in the public domain could be very helpful so that the public as well know who is. But let me just move along because I'm very aware we only have 10 minutes each on the session. So I'll come to Susannah. If you did want to reflect anything about the issue of additionality, please do. But could I also ask you what provisions you think, if any, can be put in place to guarantee that the contracted environmental outcomes that we're talking about are essentially permanent ones? How do we know that when the investment doesn't end, the whole thing just gets chopped down or mowed up or destroyed?
Sure. So I think the key thing on additionality is whether, say, for example, in the carbon credit market, there are codes currently, and what they refer to is the fact that other ecosystem services are bundled into the price of that carbon credit. Now, we know that DEFRA is looking into the stacking issue. So what that means essentially is that another ecosystem service payment might be stacked on top of that. And if you think about how that could evolve with time, if you had, for example, a native woodland which is providing both the carbon and additionally in the future a biodiversity credit stacked on top, in the future at some point it may get to the point where you can't, or an outsider can't tell whether that woodland has come about by virtue of the carbon credit itself or the future cost of that biodiversity unit. So it's very important that this is thought about in the context of stacking, and we're interested to see what DEFRA says on the issue once their research comes out. Just on, I mean, I think that this comes to, to the additionality point. On transparency, I think I would just add that, in fact, we said this in our written evidence, that transparency on who owns the assets is really important. And for us, we look at transparency around the buys of the carbon units themselves. It's a key issue in our minds. So the work of the BCMI is something we're aligned with. So buys of carbon, there is protection in that UK carbon credits can only be used to offset UK emissions. But furthermore, we're keen to see that the buyers of those carbon credits are truly trying to decarbonise, and they're only offsetting residual emissions. Just on transparency, just to finish off on that point, I think having transparency of the buyers of carbon units and the price at which those carbon units are bought is really important. Sure, the UK carbon market right now is small, but it will grow. And I think enabling transparency helps the growth of the market.
You come to the permanence bit. Sorry, I'm just very mindful of time.
Sure. On the permanence, I mean, that comes down to ensuring that there is sufficient protection on the land, conservation covenants or the like, or agreements.
How long would you put such a conservation covenant? Because, if you're offsetting on the basis of planting some trees that you're promising are going to be there for X number of years, maybe you need them to be there a hell of a lot of years.
A long time, 100 years plus.
Is that what's being proposed, 100 years plus on permanence in the current?
30.
I don't know, 80.
80. Well,
it's 30 for B&G.
Somewhere.
So shouldn't it be more than 30?
80. But it is 30.
Yeah, if it is 30, then should it not be more than 30? 30 is a blink of an evolutionary moment, isn't it?
I would agree.
So it just feels to me like there are a lot of problems in this, where there are issues that have been unresolved, something as basic as how long you need to be able to ensure that the environmental benefit that you've paid for is actually going to be sustainable seems to be utterly basic. So maybe I'll come to Dr. Steedman in my last few moments. So we've got the problem about additionality, we've got the problem about permanence, and do we also have a problem about double counting? In other words, where you've got a landowner and an investor potentially seeking credit for improving the same ecosystem, and how much of a risk is that?
Yeah. Well, we have issues. All of those are key issues that are addressed in our Flex 701 published today. So we should all go and read it. Really, I mean, you should download a copy. So additionality, additionality, permanence, quantification, verification, validation, no double counting, governance,
transparency. It's going to stop me any second. So
stacking and bundling. It's all in there.
Tell me what the report is.
I'm not going to say what the report says.
You can't tell me what
let's take it offline.
Take it offline. But,
sorry.
I should like to know what your views are about permanence in particular. How would you propose that we ensure some permanence when it comes to ensuring that the benefits that have been invested in stay there for the long term?
Well, we need principles that are appropriate to the project that is being considered, and that those levels of permanence are defined according to the nature of the solution. Okay, so they will be variable. I mean, it will depend.
So do you think 30 years is enough for B&G?
I wouldn't comment on B&G.
I rest my case. I think that there's a hell of a lot of questions here that need further answering before we go too far down this road. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. So just on that specific point, I mean, does your set of principles doesn't cover, for example, duration of a scheme?
They cover the principles by which permanence should be defined.
Right.
But
that will be different for different types of project.
Very likely.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Claudia Webb.
Thank you, Chair. And just before I start, could you just tell me the name again of your report so that we get this out the way first? The report that you published today.
The standard published today is called Flex 701. It is on the overarching nature market principles.
Great.
It's a BSI document.
Great. So could
produced for DEFRA.
Could I ask you, should standards and regulations differ between compliance nature markets as compared to voluntary nature markets?
No.
No.
No. Standards are relevant in voluntary markets and regulated markets. They are a means to support the delivery of regulation. So they should be common. The regulations should operate with the standards, not be different to the standards. The standards are a support for a structure of regulation or regulatory policy. Mm-hmm. They're an adjunct.
And just how do you enable that to happen? I mean, obviously, compliance nature markets are in themselves compliant. So if you have a developer required to make a biodiversity net gain, for example, 10% uplift, then pre-development stages, there is a compliance on that.
Yes.
How do you make that work in the voluntary nature market?
If there's a compliance element, then there will need to be a system of conformity assessment or market inspection, trading, or approvals by which that is approved. So that structure needs to be built in. If there's a regulatory requirement, then it can use the standards to deliver on a risk-based approach. It can deliver the outcome you're looking for. But the same standards can be used voluntarily or to support the delivery of a regulated requirement. And in fact, it should be the same standard because, why would you have a different standard?
And could I ask the same question of you, Suzanne, in terms of your thoughts on differences in whether the standards differ and between compliance nature markets and voluntary nature markets?
I agree, the standards should absolutely be the same. That's not the same, though, as saying the unit of payment should be the same. They don't need to be. They're just assessed differently. So if you think about the way that biodiversity net gain, it needs to be measured, monitored, and reported against over time. But the way the unit works, it is an estimate of biodiversity. It is not an exact measure.
What for you are some of the challenges of that voluntary nature market?
That there isn't a voluntary nature credit market yet. It doesn't really exist. The way the biodiversity is brought into carbon credit market is that buyers of or investors in the carbon credits like to see that nature is not ignored when they invest in carbon credit projects. And by that I mean an investor might choose to invest in a carbon credit project which is fast-growing conifer species which are non-native, for example. But the way we'd like to see biodiversity reflected is by having native woodland creation and also features that best mimic what might happen in the natural environment. So 10% areas for that are clearings to allow for native or natural regeneration, if you like. So it best mimics a natural ecosystem.
I mean, I can see if I look to my own area of the world in Leicester, I can see that my constituents will be shouting at me saying, "How can we be sure that any development from a major infrastructure project, for example, that's going to impact on communities, can be invested in if it's left to the voluntary approach by that infrastructure project, or from a compliant point of process, whether or not that major infrastructure developer would find ways to, in other words, manipulate the system or game the system." How do we get around that kind of process, those two processes?
So, I mean, under the BNG mechanism, the local authorities, I believe, have the ability to enforce. So if a seller of an off-site biodiversity unit has then sold that unit to a developer to offset the damage, then the onus is on the local authority to ensure that the biodiversity that has been provided indeed is well looked after, well managed. So there isn't the gaming opportunities don't exist.
And is the scope in terms of the biodiversity net gains, is the scope to manipulate the system when it comes to national or significant national infrastructure projects?
So for nationally significant infrastructure projects, I believe that comes into force in 2025 through the NSEP reform process. I'm not aware that it's any different from local level biodiversity net gain. I can't comment on that.
Okay. Can I just ask the same question of Paul? In terms of the standards and regulations, should they differ between compliance and voluntary nature markets?
I think I'd maybe take a slightly different tack, because I think what the other two witnesses are talking about perhaps is the regulation around the underlying unit, and I think they're absolutely right that the regulation around the underlying unit should be exactly the same. You want to understand if you have a hectare of woodland that it's being treated in the same way, for example. I would just observe that we are talking about different markets with different market infrastructure in some cases, so it is also appropriate that there would be different regulatory approaches. I mean, for example, I believe the auction for carbon credits is run by ICE, who you took evidence from in a previous session. They will have particular regulation which applies to them, which will not apply in voluntary carbon markets. So it's appropriate for there to be, and to recognise there are different regulatory approaches around some of the actual infrastructure, for example. When I say market infrastructure that's being used.
And for you, would or maybe I could ask this of Dr. Steedman, if I can come back to you. How does the BSI nature investment standards framework deal with both compliance and voluntary markets?
Well, the standards framework set a framework, and then part of that framework will be around how enforcement, or let's call it compliance, can be demonstrated, and how that can then be used by a planning authority, a regulator, a contractual obligation, a regulatory requirement to demonstrate that has been delivered. So it's all to do with the way that standards are written. It's not that it's a standard that's a mandatory thing. It's a standard that's setting out what best practice looks like, which the developer would follow and demonstrate that that's been used. So in that process, it's all about the certification of the outcome. Maybe a third-party certification is required if it's going to be a compliance approach.
Okay, Chair, I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, I think that concludes our first panel. I'd like to thank our panellists for keeping this committee at the forefront of topicality, and in particular Dr. Scott Steedman for announcing at this committee in public the first global standard set for this area. So thank you very much for doing that, and Susannah Stock for your investment and your which you announced this week, and Paul, you've kept us all waiting by telling us what it is that the Investment Association has done this week in this area. Is there anything you'd like to keep up to date with the others?
I was shamefaced when I saw 2 announcements this morning. I thought I wasn't supposed to do that, but there we go.
Just before we conclude, I think Jerome Mayhew just wanted a follow-up point very quickly.
I was just interested by Caroline's line of questioning about what does permanent look like.
Yeah.
And isn't this a classic example where theory would say that permanent means to be ad infinitum, we should have monitoring for 1,000 years or maybe longer, and practicality on the other side, where you need to develop a market, you need to engage with landowners in particular, who may feel a degree of nervousness of permanently losing control over land. And we need to research, and I'm so embarrassed that I don't know off the top of my head whether it's rather like carbon sequestration, it's a minimum of 30 years, but biodiversity net gain, I believe it's 80 years actually, is
80
more
years, yeah.
nutrient neutrality would be 80 years, so like 80 years. That the practicality of it is, if we have a monitoring system that takes you to that period, the world in which we'll be operating in by that stage will be at the earliest 2055, more likely decades after that. Would you agree that having a decent period of monitoring allows the market to become established without a realistic risk of the kind of backsliding that Caroline was concerned about? Open to whoever wishes to answer.
Maybe all I would add is it's not just perhaps the assurance of the particular asset, the particular unit that provides people confidence, but sometimes it's also the organisations which are assuring that asset. And perhaps there is an organisation around that has been doing things for 30. I mean, British Standards Institute, for example, it has its own reputation and standing which it has gained on other topics, and perhaps that's what we have to put our faith in.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. If we could switch to the second panel.
The proceeding is currently suspended. 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 The proceeding is currently suspended.
For settling down, I think you heard me say at the beginning, because I think you're all here, that we will conclude this in an hour. I am conscious that some members of the committee are going to have to leave during the course of the session. Please don't take that as any reflection of anything that you've said. It might be, but I think it's not intended to be. So I'd just like to start by inviting you all to explain your role in the organisations that you represent, just in a very brief introduction. And I think we should perhaps start with Professor Guy Standing from SOAS on the right.
Well, thank you very much. I have an interest in the commons, the natural commons, and I've written a number of books relating to the natural commons and how it should be revived. I'm a skeptic when it comes to measurement and defining of natural capital, but we'll come back to that. But in that spirit, I have a particular bee in my bonnet, and having looked at the evidence so far from your preceding deliberations, which is that there's a huge neglect, relatively speaking, of the blue commons, the blue economy. And yet we know that the sea covers 71% of the planet. It contains 80% of the world's biodiversity. It is suffering from global warming and acidification to a much greater extent as on the land. And the UK itself has a sea area that is 27 times the land area. And it gets remarkably a little attention in many of the deliberations. So you'll hear my bee in the bonnet later.
That's helpful to get that on the record. I'm sure you'll elaborate during our questions. And Dr. Pernille Holtedahl from Imperial College Business School.
Thank you. Yes, Pernille Holtedahl from Imperial College. I work at the Center for Climate Finance and Investment, which is part of the business school, where I lead what we call the nature work stream, so the work we carry out on how to bring more capital into nature, both public and private.
Thank you. And Professor David Hill, Chairman of the Environment Bank.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I'm David Hill. For my sins, back in 2006, I founded the Environment Bank and designed the biodiversity net gain and was chomping at the bit to answer the questions from the previous panel. But and I took that forwards, and gratefully, talking to many MPs, we managed to get that into the Environment Act in 2021.
Thank you. And Peter Bachmann from Gresham House.
Yes, Peter Bachmann. My name is Peter Bachmann. I'm the Managing Director of the Sustainable Infrastructure Division at Gresham House. We're a sustainability-focused asset manager. Our interest in natural capital is we believe, one of the largest owners of forestry in Europe, and we've also seeded the investment into the business called the Environment Bank, which we think is effectively created a new infrastructure asset class around investing into nature.
I pick you up then, start with you, Peter. Can you give us a sense of the scale of your investment in natural capital? And I think your colleagues have given evidence to our previous inquiry into timber, where we didn't get onto the natural capital aspect of it, but where you've been investing in forests, have you also been investing in natural capital as a separate class, or has that been coincidental?
In addition to that, so we have about $3.5 billion of forestry in assets under management, which is pretty significant. We've also committed £240 million to the Environment Bank to build out habitat banks. So collectively, nearly £4 billion. So a relatively large commitment.
Into David's Environment Bank?
Correct.
Right.
Yes.
So you're the largest investor in that, are you, therefore? Yeah. Thank you. Well, David, I'm going to encourage you to. Some of the questions will refer to the previous panel a bit, but could we just get a sense for the extent, the scale of investment activity that you've undertaken in recent years? Since I think 2006, you were probably a fairly slow starter because you were ahead of the game. But how many transactions have you undertaken in sort of contemporary natural capital?
Still very small. So back in 2006, it was really around lobbying to get the idea of biodiversity net gain embedded. And I'd spent 20 years really designing mitigation schemes for developments that really delivered square root of nothing, frankly. They were very, very poor. So I realised we just needed to disrupt the whole system in how we deliver biodiversity in relation to development. So we started with probably, I think we did around 15 to 18 individual bespoke biodiversity offset sites. And I said back at the time that we should see a situation where developers deliver gains for nature, not just an offset, and going through the mitigation hierarchy and all of that. Since then, those bespoke sites are sort of okay, but they're not desperately good because you can't deliver at big scale. So you really need large-scale investment to enable you to lock down land and deliver sites of 40, 50 and plus hectares or over 100 acres. And we've got 23 sites in, still small number, but 23 sites now gone through legals, another around 70 sites in legals, and we intend to deliver around 2,000 or so hectares a year. That's
2,000 hectares a year.
And that's still a relatively small amount.
And that's all in relation to biodiversity net gain?
Entirely in relation to biodiversity
and that's
net
all,
gain.
picking up Guy's point, that's all on land?
And it's all on land, although I take Guy's point that the marine environment is critically undervalued because it's quite a difficult environment in which to work, let's face it. So, but it is being looked at. So marine renewables is one that I'm particularly interested in. And can you, without getting into the detail, there ought to be reasons why you could start to trade for what you're doing in the marine environment to on-land coastal fringe habitat creation, such as saline lagoons, which are a priority habitat. I think there's a lot of merit in that, and that's being looked at the moment.
One of the issues that haven't really got into yet in the committee is the extent to which there is conflict between, we touched on it a little bit earlier, carbon credits and natural capital credits, and in particular, you mentioned renewables offshore, but is there conflict between renewable development onshore and natural capital opportunity? I heard from I think it was Cornwall Wildlife Trust that they have a 20-year site which happens to be a solar farm, and that the biodiversity on the land, which has not got panels shading it, or even if it has got it shading it, is better than anything else they've come across in Cornwall, because it's been there for 20 years with undisturbed land. That would appear to be... Is that something that gets factored into solar panel applications yet?
Indeed it does. And I'd have to say that if you do have a land parcel left for 20 years or managed with an intervention for biodiversity for 20 years, it is going to take shape quite well. You only need to look at some of the rewilding projects in, for example, NEP. After 15 years, they're generating a lot of value. However, I'm not a great fan of that industrialisation of the landscape and then saying, and we've got all this biodiversity value. I'd like to see things a bit more wild than that, if I'm really honest. And I think it's a bit of a travesty if we're just trying to fit our biodiversity near to or adjacent to solar panels. I think we can do things a lot better than that. I mean, it's good to do that, but we can do more than that, and we have to do more than that.
Pernille, if I just turn to you, could you give us a sense from your academic perspective on the scale of the opportunity here and what the main challenges are in order to make it a credible market for people to invest in?
Yes, I think I'll take sort of global perspective just to that's sort of been my research area. So there is an identified nature financing gap of between 600 and 800 billion annually, globally. As a result, several studies have come out showing that since 2020. And very much in the wake of those studies, the next statement has quite often been, and therefore the private sector must get involved. But if we look at traditionally who has invested in nature, it's been government. About 84% globally in nature investments has been covered by government. And we may say maybe because they didn't have a better idea of how to do it, but it might also be that it's sort of the natural remit for governments. I'm not saying this because I don't think there's a role for private capital in nature, but I do think it's a fairly minor one and it has to be tailored. We've done some research at my institute where, for instance, if you just look at investments, today globally, we calculated about 41 billion private investments annually going into nature investments, and that's including green bonds, which you could argue how much of that is actually going towards additional green projects. But if you look at that number in comparison to the global gap of 600 to 800 billion, and thinking about all the hurdles that are always pointed out in research. Oh, we need to fix the liquidity problem, the scaling problem, the lack of standardization problem. Once we fix those, everything else will come into place, i.e. private investments. My question back, well then, what if we can't fix those problems? And again, I don't want to put a stop to this debate because I do want to see private markets succeed, but I just think we have to be realistic about where they can succeed and how they can succeed. So definitely a strong role for governments in creating markets. BNG is a wonderful example of that. Let's follow up. Let's look at how BNG develops. Let's monitor. Let's make sure it has intended consequences. But then there are many other opportunities and areas where the public sector will have to continue playing a massive role because so much of nature is, after all, or has public good features. So it's going to be difficult for a private investor to carve out a space there. But there are definitely areas where there is room for private investments, and we see many good examples, but it's just, I wanted to put that into sort of a perspective.
So the Task Force for Nature Financial Disclosure is imposing obligations on private companies to start to describe their impact on nature. Isn't that going to start to lead to changes in behaviour and the need to create offsets for companies to mitigate?
Depends on how much time you have. So I don't think we have hundreds of years because we're in a biodiversity crisis and a climate crisis. So I think it's naive to think that by asking for transparency, we're going to bring in lots of money. It's a good step. It's a necessary step. Very much encourage it. But let's just be honest about what that can do. And even if that were to lead to greater investments over time, it would be in a time frame that wouldn't be relevant for me, my children, or my grandchildren. So we need more than just transparency.
Do you think that the introduction of mandatory schemes, such as biodiversity net gain, you think that will be too slow in having an impact on nature?
No. So compliance mechanisms can be, if they're done well, and I definitely have time and patience for that, to see that role. And in fact, we have to take the time to make sure it's integrated and developed correctly. Because I'll quickly point to some other research that's been done internationally, which I think is interesting. I'd like to bring to the attention of this committee today in terms of what has happened globally in terms of when we've had biodiversity offsets. There's one study looking at wetland mitigation schemes in the US, which they've been around for 30 years, and the most famous scheme, so to speak. And that study, which was a meta-study, so a study of studies, showed that only in 30% of the cases were the objectives achieved. In some cases, the projects weren't even initiated. So that sounds like terrible monitoring to me, and it sounds incredible that it's happened, but I'm putting it out there because it's relevant for you in terms of B&G and following that up. So I think sometimes we get very excited about creating markets. I do too, but then the next step is to make sure that those markets lead to the outcomes. And biodiversity is also, it's incredibly complex. So I think in some of these cases, what we might see is someone sets aside an area for nature and you have some regrowth, which might definitely be better than nothing, but to believe that it's actually going to lead to full biodiversity, I think in many cases is also asking for too much.
Yeah. So that leads us neatly onto monitoring and baseline and what we were talking about in the previous panel, but I'm just going to let Professor Standing come in. He's already had quite a good go, but in relation to accepting that there aren't any schemes at the moment in the marine environment, but there are projects to start growing kelp to sequester carbon in marine environments. Do you see that as having a value which is demonstrable and can be monetized and invested in?
Well, I'm aware that in the background of this discussion that we're talking about natural capital and monitoring and measuring. And we've been having this debate on natural capital ever since the Earth Summit of 1992, Rio 92. We're now 32 years later, and we've still got a feeling where I heard the chairman of the last session describe biodiversity net gain as amorphous. I liked that word. I appreciated that word. And I think we're in a situation where we can't measure many of the things, and we never will be able to measure it. And we have to be honest. And the question becomes for monitoring, is an incomplete measure of ecosystem services, for example, better than no measure? I'm unconvinced that an incomplete partial measure is appropriate. And there's a second point I want to make, which is that we've been mobilizing finance, private markets, ever since Maurice Strong took over UNEP back in the beginning of the 90s. And you almost have a hypothesis that the more finance is mobilized, the greater the finance gap. Last session you referred to estimates of a finance gap. Well, that finance gap has been growing and growing. And UNEP puts it 4 times the level that you gave in the last session. So I'm not sure how we can get a monitoring system when you have an amorphous concept, incomplete data, and you need to get some sort of governance system going. And I think with it, whether it's in marine areas or forestry or everything, the weaker the database on outcomes, whatever they might be, the weaker that is, the stronger the indicators we need of governance. And in that regard, I think it's vital that we set up a governance structure which is going to respect the principles of preserving and enhancing the value of nature. Okay, and we don't have that at the moment.
Okay, thank you very much. Barry Gardner's got a very quick supplementary, and then Jerome
Indeed.
Mayhew.
Professor Stanning, I absolutely hear what you're saying, and I agree with you about the need to create that framework. But would you agree that the traditional way of going about using natural capital has resulted in what we heard, the 52% intactness? It's resulted in the 70% loss of nature diversity in this country. And actually, we should actually now be trying to give it a chance, at least if we're measuring it or trying to. And I agree with all that you've said about the difficulties that poses.
Barry, I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt you because I know Jerome has to leave very shortly, and as you're getting into a debate rather than a question, I'm going to let Jerome ask his questions and we'll come back to you. Jerome.
So I am going to talk about monitoring and who should be monitoring, but before I get on to those, Professor Hill, you said you were chomping at the bit to answer some of the questions from the earlier panel, so this is your opportunity to provide the answer. I believe what you were referring to was the biodiversity net gain, whether it should be 30 years or 80 years. It was that area, I think.
Well, and actually, Mr. Mayor, you answered the question, because back in the day, we had the RSPB, who I used to work for years and years ago, want 1,000 years, and eventually we actually came down to a pragmatic view, and the pragmatic view is simply what would the landowner farmer accept as a contract. And they were used to 10-year ESA agreements, 10-year countryside stewardship agreements. When we started to talk about 20, 25, 30, we were really pushing at the boundary. So the whole process could have just completely collapsed had we gone for 80 to 100. And that's just pragmatics, I think, really. And I'm much happier that we've got 30 than 0. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Okay, well, I'm glad to give you the opportunity to come back on that. Right, I may as well stick with you, but this is really for a question for everyone. Let's start with the basics. Who do you think should be responsible for monitoring? If we've got this market, imperfect as it may be, but it's perhaps a step in the right direction. We know that monitoring is very important for the credibility of the market. Should it be the state? Should it be the contracting parties? Should it be and other? Who should monitor and evaluate? What's the best solution for this?
Well, I think the barrier is around the cost. So as part of what we do deliver that monitoring and reporting, which is completely transparent. We use a whole range of methodologies from LiDAR, spectral reflectance, habitat condition monitoring, eDNA. All of those things are really important, and we do that because we know that the planning authorities in relation to BNG just don't have the resource, and they don't have the capacity or the people that could actually do it.
Or the long-term view.
And definitely
with a project.
Definitely long term. And so we're saying that if we are to make a profit out of raising BNG units and credits, then we ought to be in the position to provide the independent data that can be reviewed by everyone. It would be a wrong and poorly governed system if we were to just collect the data and keep it to ourselves. That would be pointless. So we don't do that.
So do you anticipate a audit process? So
Indeed, yeah.
You have annual reporting, and then rather as my previous career as a business analyst, and you provide your reports, then you're audited.
Indeed, and there's a second element to that really, which is the monitoring and enforcement responsibilities of the planning authority also need to be addressed, because we can see a barrier there in the planning authorities not actually delivering the duty properly. So I'd sort of spoken to the Office for Environmental Protection to say that they could have a really good, almost like Ofsted role on the planning authorities to assess what they're doing in terms of delivering their Section 106 agreements on planning on development sites. And I think that's...
Are you concerned that planning departments are not being sufficiently onerous in requiring...
Always have been, and we haven't yet seen a material shift in that. And this is one of the biggest problems with trying to design mitigation schemes back in the day, 20 years ago, was that the planning authorities would spend 2.5 years public inquiry, getting all the level of detail down for these planning applications. They're given permission. The developer then goes back to say, oh, it's a bit difficult to make this viable. And the planning authority say, oh, yeah, okay then. And where do we go with that? Because it just doesn't deliver. It doesn't deliver anything for biodiversity.
This is on the affordability argument, isn't it? Where
indeed, yeah.
Prices have changed. Okay. Just before I move on, does anyone else want to come in? So, Professor Standing, and then.
Yeah, I think this gets to the heart of the monitoring, because who does the monitoring depends on defining the groups that matter, and that's why a commons perspective is so much has so much potential. If you go back to the Magna Carta and the Charter of the Forest, which are the two constitutional pillars of British society, the defining of a monitor was linked to the defining of stewards. The steward has responsibility for preserving the value of nature. And the sovereign accepted that and was geared to being the monitor of ensuring the value is kept. But you also need gatekeepers to hold the monitors, the stewards, to account. And that's enshrined in those documents. Now, the problem we have today is that all our agencies, government agencies, mix principals and agents. They are neither gatekeepers nor entirely geared to being growth agents. You take DEFRA, you take Natural England, you take the Forestry Commission. They are partly oriented to making profit and partly oriented to being gatekeepers. So they are not effective in either respect. This ambivalence. And I think if you want an effective system of preserving and enhancing nature, you have to have definitive, strong stewards. Okay. And the Crown Estate is not that either.
I'm going to cut you short just because we're so short of time. Very interesting argument. I mean, the Forestry Commission would counter that by saying they have discrete parts of their organisation. They have Forest Enterprise, which commercial activities.
Exactly, and they've sold off to private equity.
But I know what you mean.
They have. I can give you the name of the private equity company that is making profit in the Forestry Commission.
We can have an interesting discussion after this about the Forestry Commission. I don't want to get sidetracked. But they also have a separate part of their organisation which deals with commissions, which is unrelated to Forest Enterprise, is what I suspect they would say.
Chinese firewall.
Not so much about who should do it, but I want to bring in a point on, again, these international studies show that the cases that tended to show better effectiveness in the long run were the ones that built in buffers, so that when you do when you do monitor and the results come short, which they, I wouldn't say perhaps invariably, but quite often will. Yeah, so in the voluntary carbon market, you have that standards typically ask the project developers to set aside a buffer, and you probably maybe do that in the BNG.
And that's 20%. Is that the sort of thing we're talking?
I mean, that sounds reasonable to me, but I just put that in there as something, a good ingredient.
Yeah, look, firstly, to answer your question, 52% puts us in the bottom 10% globally in terms of biodiversity. So I think it's worth recognising that. And I think also, nature is really, really powerful in terms of the fight for net zero. You can't do net zero without nature. So, there's a really big driver to do this. And I think if we want to create ultimately a standard that can generate lots of external capital to scale this properly, monitoring, evaluation, and ultimately the enforcement of it is really, really critical. So the one good thing that we've been able to raise a significant amount of capital around this asset class because there is the DEFRA metric. So that is a relatively simple, objective tool that you can show up to an investor, you can show to anyone, objectively determine how much you've put in there, therefore how much biodiversity net gain you can create. And I think that's a really key part. So there's a simple mechanism, but then ultimately I think what we need is a level playing field, and we need that to be enforced. So at the moment, the BNG regulations really only apply off-site. You should have an on-site mechanism as well, and then they should all be policed. You should have an equivalent to the Environment Agency, the way they enact permissions.
Far answers, because I've run out of time, I'm afraid. Who should be monitoring? Should it be reported to a central organisation? Yes? No?
I believe that. I believe it should.
Yes.
I do believe
you need a lot of transparency around that.
Yeah, that's a version of that.
I thought about it.
Okay, and no, very quickly.
Multi-layers. It needs government, it needs local common groups, and it needs different stakeholders. I don't like the term, but it needs different layers.
Okay, I understand that. And frequency of monitoring, bearing in mind the juxtaposition between cost and completeness. Stab in the dark, annually?
Annually is relatively suitable.
Annually, but then it can actually be less frequent as time goes by, as you get the maturity.
So it should respond to the conditions.
Exactly, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Great. And final, very quick question. The programme, should the monitoring programme extend beyond the end of an investment to ensure that the environmental outcomes are permanent? I mean, we've got the 30 years in terms of nutrient neutrality, which is aligned. It's 80 years currently. If you want to go beyond that, who pays and how do you organise it? Have you got it?
I think it might happen because when you get to the 30 years, and there was a question about the persistence of the site, and I think it came from here. So I would actually say yes, you need the persistence, and you actually need to go beyond 30 because you can actually re-baseline because of the next 30 years beyond is where you can actually sell the units for the management into the future, and that's what I would like to see.
So there is actually a potential for a market beyond the 30 years.
I believe there really is. Yeah.
We've been doing legacy surveys, so if the recidivism takes place or if the benefits continue, and I think they are really useful.
Thank you, and apologies that I'm rudely leaving straight away.
Thank you, Jerome. Clive Lewis.
Thank you, Chair. And because you're such an indulgent Chair, and because I love our clerk so much, I am going to ask the first question that's been asked that I've been given, but I'm just going to kind of maybe slightly detour off of that after, if that's okay with your indulgence, Chair. So onto technology, onto the technological component or the technology that we can use to be able to monitor natural capital. We heard from the other panel, which some of you were present for, the new Flex 701 report, things like additionality, permanence. There seems to be a lot of gaps in our capacity to be able to measure and give the kind of basic infrastructure that we can measure to be able to then standardize these processes. I just wonder what role technology could play in that, in being able to find a way through it, for example, in the oceans and other areas which are proving difficult. Is this a kind of a way that we can kind of cut through and do that? Is that something that can be used by anyone?
There's an explosion in technological advances that, looking at a company called Nature Metrics with environmental DNA, they're revolutionising the speed and the cost issues. And way back, I wrote a book on how to survey birds for survey work that you do for EIAs. It's incredibly costly, but you can actually do things with sonograms now, which can actually collect information with standing sonogram data and apparatus. So I think technology is moving into that space, but I still believe, maybe I'm old-fashioned, but I still believe there has to be still a role for people in this because it's very difficult to get a really good understanding of an ecosystem's functionality just by trying to aggregate a series of technological pieces of kit. I've not seen it happen yet, but in 10, 15 years' time, it may well be different.
We have 10 or 15 years? Is that something
we don't have even 1 year?
So the technology isn't there yet, but it's something that could...
It's incredible the way, the speed with which technology has advanced in the last 5 years.
Anyone else?
No. Yeah, I want to mention in passing in this respect the whole thing about deep sea mining. Okay, the technology for deep sea mining is explosively rapid now. The marine scientists almost unanimously say that it would be ecologically disastrous to take off, and yet the technologies for assessing the dangers are being sidelined, whereas the technologies for increasing growth, blue growth as it's called, has been accepted. So I think the technological issues have to be treated very seriously and integrated into the monitoring, the evaluation process and so on. But it's both in what's the technologies in the process, in the markets, and technologies for assessing what is happening.
I want to read two statements out, and I just wanted, because when I think about natural capital, I do feel that we're trying to, so often, especially after today's session, fit a square peg into a round hole. And the two statements I wanted to kind of read out were, is the whole issue of natural capital, the way that we're approaching it, is the question that's being asked, how do you maintain profitability and consumption growth on a dying planet? Or is it coming from, how do you replenish a dying planet in a way that ensures sustained productive capacity? And my overriding feeling is it's the first statement, that we're trying to continue to squeeze out profitability and growth. That's the primary. How do we keep on doing that and stop the planet from dying? Where it seems to me that we need to kind of change the equation around to the second statement, which is we've got a dying planet. How do we stop that, but also keep up some kind of, we don't want to go back into caves, a sustainable productive capacity? And it doesn't feel to me it's a second statement. It feels it's the first, and that's what this is about.
But I would definitely back the second, not the first.
I would back the second, but it doesn't feel to me, given where we are, 50%, Singapore on the edge of ecological collapse, some of these technologies 15 years away, it doesn't feel to me that that's the primary motivation of this.
Can I say, though, that I think the UK should applaud itself for the Environment Act, and that's actually put a price on nature. And because of that, we are going to see really rapid action on creating additional biodiversity that wasn't there before. So, I think there was a concept of polluter pays, generally within what we should be trying to do. And that's a good example of how the UK government can take a leadership position in mandating the requirement to do biodiversity for someone that has an objective to pay and has a profit, the developer. But, how do you move that into other markets in such a way that you can generate change? So like the landfill tax is another one that's been incredible in this country to change the amount of organic waste out of the waste system almost overnight. So, you need to find ways in which you capture the profit, call it that, in such a way that you can redirect it into something that has really meaningful good for the planet.
So that's really interesting, because I wanted to kind of come to you, if I could, on this. So Dasgupta says that we need 1.6 planet. We need, current consumption is 1.6.
Well, the UK is about 2.6, actually.
So 2.6. Oh, 2.6 for the UK. It's even worse. Thank you. And so I'm just looking. So I'm looking on our net zero targets. We've based our net zero targets on territorial emissions, not consumption emissions. That's how we're going to meet net zero. So it's not actually what we consume. We're outsourcing a lot of our productive capacity to poorer countries, developing countries, BRIC economies, who are taking, pumping out that pollution, paying people less, and we get to say that we hit net zero. Is it not the case that on this issue as well, with natural capital, can we envisage a future where this country is moving up to 70 or 80% green and verdant? And what we've actually done is we've used those international markets to outsource pollution and in ecological destruction in the poorest countries who can't say no, who don't have that capital to be able to afford this, and who get, basically, we have a two-tier world where you have a world which is green and lush if you're wealthy, and then you live in a hell zone where all the productive capacity is. That's where I feel this could well be ending up. What's to stop that from happening?
Well, I think that is exactly where it is going at the moment, and we have really, that we cannot countenance that at any cost. And so it sort of answers a bit of a question I think was posed earlier. I think that Pernille said $600 to $800 billion, if I'm right, is the gap. 56 billion for the UK. Now, I'm going to be a heretic and say, actually, I would love it if that didn't have to come from the private sector. If it was just a government factor that you spent that money, 5.6 billion a year. It is not going to happen. And that's the sad fact of it. It's not going to happen. I would love it if that were the case. Yes, taxes would rise. Sorry, but that for me would get to what I would like to see. But it isn't going to happen. So we've got to rely and force, not just rely on. We've actually got to force the private sector to do this. We've got to force the consumption of all of us to actually do this and deliver it. So. Am I optimistic? There are some days when I'm really optimistic that we can actually embrace the markets, and there are other days when I just see consumption becoming ridiculously high, and we are 2.6 and going beyond. But to see a situation where we outsource our damage just for us to live in a great place is catastrophic.
Our history is
correct.
One that
Yeah.
would suggest
Correct.
that is what's going to happen. We can see that recently. We can see it.
And there is the big challenge. There's no doubt about it.
But I mean, capturing the externalities of our consumption is the really big. I mean, that's the big elephant in the room. That this is probably a bit beyond certainly what we're able to talk about.
Beyond this committee, I mean, we're talking about restructuring global capitalism, which I wouldn't mind doing. I would very much like to do that, but I think probably we won't get there. At least not in this room. I won't be able to do it for sure. But keeping that in mind, what is it that we can do? And to pick up on your point on voluntary versus mandated actions. So we did a study last year at Imperial looking at corporates and the extent to which they invest in biodiversity. What were the drivers? So it was a case study. What we found was that none of these corporations undertook any sizable biodiversity action except in the case when they were mandated to do so. So you're probably not surprised, but so this is what we're dealing with now. While we're waiting for markets to develop, and we've already established that most probably those markets won't be able to cover all areas, we shouldn't be shy about telling companies what to do. If you're destroying something, don't destroy it. If you're going to destroy it, fix it. You can do this through permits, legislation, how you build wind farms, how you build, you ask, and so the company or the sector where we found the most voluntary, it wasn't voluntary, but the most biodiversity action was in renewable energy sector, where they were told they had to preserve the biodiversity around where they were. So they did it. It didn't cost very much either, in comparison to the capex on their main project, right? So those are, for me, the easy wins. And then we need to bring in all the other sectors. And I think there's a case for extending that sort of thinking to other types of assets. For instance, water utilities. You can build a purification plant, or you can, in some cases, buy up a woodland adjacent to it and use the natural purification services of nature. When in that case, in addition, you get all the co-benefits, such as increased biodiversity, it's a lovely place to go for a walk, hunting. There are examples of that in this country and definitely in the United States. So these are cases where you can, I think of it as mainstreaming nature into the economy and into the way other assets are built, in addition to creating separate markets, which might be necessary. But we need to bring those layers in, because otherwise private sector will find it difficult in the current incentive systems to do this, because they won't be making revenues, they won't be cutting costs, and the risks are higher.
Can I just add, I think we are seeing also investor pressure on corporates, so they can't actually secure investment into their own business growth unless they do it. And that I think it's almost a semi-compliance, voluntary type of approach, which I think will escalate, and is already escalating quickly, and will come more to the fore before there is, for example, a compliance market through TNFD, and that's where we've got to get to, in my view.
And that's an opportunity for the UK to mandate something like the TNFD to at least be the halfway house to becoming a compliance market more generally.
Susannah, very briefly, is that possible? I've got no more questions. I just know that you didn't answer.
Yeah, last point I'd like to make with respect to this is, I think with all of these private investments, and public for that matter, we need rigid control through environmental impact assessments before the investments go, okay? And we don't have that. We may pretend we have, but for example, auctioning off the seabed to multinational companies did not have proper independent assessments done beforehand. And if you don't have that, you don't have baseline or monitoring capacity, and you're pretending. And I think that's a very, very important aspect of this.
Thank you, Clive. I'm just picking up on your comment about corporates getting involved in this. And one of the issues for the UK as a location for investing natural capitals, we don't have large, you mentioned, David, 2,000 to 3,000 hectares a year. We don't have large expanses of nature depleted area, which in this global scale, where whatever it is, 1% to 2% of the landmass. But other places do. So from an international perspective, if you're a major international conglomerate and you're looking to make an impact you might wish to find a million hectares of outback in Australia or wherever. Is the UK engaged in that kind of trade at this point? I don't think it's what the Environment Bank does. No. I don't know whether Peter is following this internationally.
Internationally, I can't speak to that. You know, we
Neil, do you follow what's happening?
In terms of compensating, I was thinking in terms of offsets or
are corporates yet engaged in investing in improving nature in parts of the world in order to be able to meet the kind of financing demands
you mentioned? So international conglomerates, for instance, could be a UK company which has supply chains in tropical countries. Typically, they will and they already are looking after their own supply chains. And so investing in nature and in regenerative, let's say, agriculture in Indonesia with the products that they then use later. That's more internally. When it comes to sort of big, at the government level, you have bigger mechanisms for compensating and transferring to countries in the tropical south for these purposes, but not that I'm aware of. Corporates.
I do.
David and Guy.
I do know that African Parks, for example, is transformational in its work in Africa, having taken over since about 2010. I might get the figures wrong. They've restored 20 million hectares and have got another 10 million to do by 2030. And they are just at the process of looking at the sort of the biodiversity credits type of approach and market. And I think that would be a phenomenal one. I've talked to them recently about that, and but actually, you know, if you look at the land cover in the UK, 72% of whatever it is is farmland. If you see a decline in meat in the diet, for example, you could suddenly release a very large area of arable farmland that's used to grow crops that we feed to livestock, which is desperately inefficient in one respect. And you could actually see that could free up land that we could actually do this for and rebuild ecosystems.
Thank you, Guy. Very briefly, if you would.
Yeah. Just a minor correction. In terms of our seabed, we have over 4 million square miles. And the government made a contract with the subsidiaries of Lockheed Martin in 2011 for exploration for minerals in over 1 million square miles. Now, I think that is an incredible thing, and it was not transparent.
Right, thank you. Kat Smith.
Thank you, Chair. Peter, is there any way of ensuring that people that are investing in natural capital are actually trying to reduce their own environmental impact and not just using it as a way of offsetting?
Look, I think there's been some discussions around the transparency of the buyers, so I think that there's certainly something of that. In respect of the biodiversity net gain mechanism, the developer has a specific obligation to improve the biodiversity of the site, and then they're buying their units, and that's directly compensating for the lost biodiversity there. So I think in that respect, the biodiversity net gain unit is quite complete, and it doesn't allow people to greenwash, I think is what your main point is. I think as we start to move into the voluntary market, the corporates, certainly that's an area that we need to be really hot on, and you need to be seeing that people are doing everything they can also in their supply chain and their business generally to impact the planet properly. But I think we need to be really hot on that. That's really around the evaluation and the policing of actually the things that they're investing in, and that kind of comes back to, for us, there's got to be a lot of financial certainty as well as the ecological certainty in what we're doing. Because I think part of what's gone wrong in the carbon market has been that a lot of these projects probably never actually completed, and there's a questionable scientific elements to them as well. But you need both ecological integrity and certainty, and you need financial certainty as well, and you need to be really cognizant of what they're investing in ultimately, and what is their nature product that they're looking to try to tout about, talk about.
Yeah, I'm trying to understand the mindset of investors here. So how can investors influence company behaviour just to be more nature positive?
Well, I think David alluded to it. We talked about TNFD. I think as investors, we need to be pushing that obligation down. And then to the extent that you could make TNFD an obligation for all corporates to be reporting from, say, next year, that would be a really good start, because ultimately you don't really start to change your activities unless you measure and monitor it. So I think these are the sorts of things that we can do to try to actually change and drive change within corporates. But it probably needs a little bit of your influence, but I think investors have a really big part to play in driving our investee companies to do things well.
And can I ask what you think the pros and cons are of mandating the recommendations by the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures?
I think TNFD is a good mechanism. It is certainly more complex in some respects than perhaps trying to take it really simply. I think my fear is that it allows greenwashing and the things that you described as well. So I think we just need to be really careful in the way that we allow people to do that. We need to be cognizant of what sort of products they're buying from, and therefore, do you have that ecological integrity at the core of what they're ultimately going to be investing in or buying, call it that, as part of a TNFD program. But TNFD generally, I think, is part of the tools that I think we need to be putting in place to ensure that we get absolutely that we need to race to the top in terms of ecological integrity right now. And so we should be doing everything we can to push the requirements up, not down.
And does any other member of the panel have anything to add to the questions I've just asked Peter? I'm conscious of time though, so I know I've got another colleague that needs to get in.
On TNFD and mandating, I would say investors more than anything and corporates more than anything want predictability. So if you're going to, if there are no TNFDs coming up, they're going to be subject to it. I think most have said that they wouldn't mind that. They're quite welcome that. Also, it means that there's a level playing field in terms of expectations across the board. Having said that, obviously, it shouldn't be an overly onerous experience, so we have to be mindful of making it something that's doable, but across the board, yes, I would support that becoming mandatory.
And it isn't about offsetting either. So TNFD, as I understand it, is about changing behaviours throughout a supply chain to reduce impacts and then compensating or going nature positive in a possibly a less quantitative methodology than we have with BNG, but to go to nature positive at whatever scale uplift that makes by buying into ecosystem function restoration schemes, the likes that we're creating and others are creating. So.
Right, anything else back to the
Thank you, Kat. Matthew Offord.
Let's say that Hardin got it wrong and that really is a tragedy of the commons. I wanted to explore really what would happen, particularly in an environment where investors had been involved and it simply didn't work for one reason or another. So we had a monitoring of a natural capital asset and the targets weren't being met. What would happen?
Well, definitely, if the monitoring showed it hasn't happened, you'd have a let's take a particular site, whatever it might be as an example. If the monitoring showed that that was failing and it was going off trajectory according to a habitat management agreement or plan, you'd have to have a restorative fund in place that actually intervenes to rebalance and get the site back on track. And that can happen by a variety of reasons. In extremis, it can be because the landowner has been negligent and failed. And in our model, we expect to hold the landowner and farmer to account on that. But in other situations, it may be a series of droughts or heavy flooding, as we've seen, both of which we see. And that will lead to habitat degradation or could lead to habitat degradation. So there needs to be, as part of the agreement with the landowner farmer, a restorative fund that puts that back. Because if you haven't got that, really, have you therefore got the legitimacy to be selling units from that site in the first place? That's what I would say.
And you need a mechanism, if that farmer isn't doing the right thing, for a funder to step in effectively to ensure you do get the environmental outcomes that you want. So, I think that's an element that we need to make sure that we have the protections in place to ensure that you get the ecological outcomes that you're seeking from the start.
Mr. Stanley.
Yeah, I think Hardin's article was one of the worst on the subject of
thought
the
you
commons.
might say that.
and basically, he was describing an unregulated market. Mm-hmm. And he was not describing a commons, as a commons requires a governance with stewards and gatekeepers and respect for principles like the public trust doctrine, the intergenerational equity doctrine, and the precautionary principle, and things like that. So, and then towards the end of his life, he confessed that he should have said the unmanaged commons. But that didn't rescue him from his bad article. So that's all I have to say on that one.
That doesn't come as a surprise, but it's interesting to hear you say it. But let's take it from the other perspective of the investor, for example. What if they pull out for whatever reason?
Could I give you a perspective? I think what we're trying to do is to provide absolute certainty day one that habitat will be funded for the whole 30 years, and we can demonstrate through a letter of credit or similar sort of mechanism to show that we've got all of the costs to maintain and operate that habitat bank for the full 30 years. So I think that's really incumbent on us, call it that, and the market as we're developing it up, to demonstrate financial certainty as well as the ecological certainty. So I think that's a thing we need to be pushing into the market, to demonstrate that you have absolute certainty around funding.
Well, I understand what you're saying, but scenarios do occur where it simply is unavoidable. We had a financial crash, we had COVID, all these things that we never expected to happen. And that's what I'm trying to get to. In a scenario where it did happen, where an investor pulled out, the consequences for a project obviously would be dire. But who would be expected to step in if that did happen? Would it be Natural England, or would it be the government? Or
so what we've done is actually put a letter of credit in place on habitat banks. Irrespective of the funder's solvency, there is certainty that the ecological outcomes will be delivered. And I think that's a pretty high bar that we've set ourselves as to what is required there. But I think in that very obscure case, I think you'd need to consider it goes back to the landowner and the developer, which isn't the right place for that obligation to land.
Okay, I think that about covers it actually.
Thank you. So does that operate a little bit like a bond?
It does.
The money is actually sitting there, or has it been paid out and it's an insurance policy?
It's a high street bank letter of credit in the case that we're trying to put in, and therefore, irrespective of us, it's a on-demand bond effectively.
So, in the case of a developer scheme, so the developer's obliged to buy natural capital credits, pays up front, pays also for the management for the duration of the scheme up front. Is that right? How do you ensure that management activity takes place over 30 years, which may exceed the life of the people who did the deal, and how does that happen?
So in our case, we've contractualised it, so all of the obligations are contractualised, and they're there to be stepped in if one of those parties don't work. The letter of credit there provides a financial assurity as well to ensure that everyone is there and able to deliver it beyond the lifetime of any of us probably. So, that's really key. And that's where I also talk about the on-site market needs to be on the same level playing field, because at the moment the on-site market doesn't really have the same purview as the off-site market. And I think you really want to ensure the ecological outcomes both on and off-site. So I think we need to be trying to raise the bar, call it that, to provide certainty that the ecological outcomes will ultimately be delivered.
And in the event of an off-site deal that fails, so one's planted a crop and the crop fails, does the maintenance value provide enough to be able to continue to replant or restock if you have to do that?
Yeah, indeed. So we have almost like an insurance fund that is the restrictive fund for the collection of habitat banks, and that is used to draw down if and when it's needed, if there's a failure in the system.
But there is specific insurance put in place to cover normal peril, and so you are really at a very, very nub issue around that.
I think the bigger issue is actually that there will be providers that don't do that. So you've got at the moment quite a range of delivery models from a farmer landowner saying buy my credits, but you haven't got any infrastructure or governance in place to deliver it, and that's a real risk, I think. And then, as Peter said, the on-site point is extraordinary, because we feel that there should be a level playing field. On-site should be under the same scrutiny, because if you're giving a developer a planning permission on the basis of them doing BNG, if 90% of it is on-site and it fails because they walk away, and it will, because that's why I set the Environment Bank up in the first place, then you're going to lose all of that biodiversity value such that it is. And it's much better to put the liability into a third party who knows how to do that and deliver it, because the developers won't and don't.
So what the developer might do if they're claiming they can do it on site is to try and get the purchasers, the ultimate householders if it's a housing development, or corporate if it's a commercial scheme, to take on the management responsibility as part of their transaction.
And that's always the case.
Which will be very challenging to put that liability onto householders who may have no interest at all.
Absolutely, and what happens is that biodiversity by its very nature, if it's at scale, is actually very untidy. And if you're trying to put that within a housing scheme, you can guarantee, and we've got lots of evidence of this, that within 5 years, once the developer's gone off and done the next scheme, that gets amenitized, puts into amenity grassland to walk the dogs and all of that, and so you lose the value.
Yeah. Well, we as MPs all have experience of schemes with unadopted roads that are put in by a developer, don't get completed, and then who's responsible for it? The answer is no one.
The answer is the leaseholder.
Yes. Barry, you were coming towards a question, I think, in your earlier intervention.
I'm very grateful to you because I did want to pursue that. Thank you, Chair. Classic economics has regarded the sort of ecosystem services that Dr. Pernille was talking about, the woodland providing the watershed and so on, as externalities, the pollination services of the bees, whatever. And classical economics has not served us well because it's precisely not put a value on those externalities. And what I want to get to the heart of is why you feel, and maybe you don't, but it came across in what you were saying, that this approach of putting a value on those externalities is fundamentally mistaken. I agree with you about all the framework that needs to be around this and all the government needs to do, but it seems to me that if we make a start of trying to say these things too have value more than the intrinsic or spiritual value that they certainly do possess, that we can perhaps reorient or refocus the way in which we debate things around, which at the moment is through that classical economic view.
Well, I think externalities is obviously a big elephant in the room in this whole debate. And I don't think the natural capital approach is actually getting to the heart of dealing with externalities. I mean, you take the marine aspect of the economy as an example. We have subsidies, vast amounts of subsidies. I did a book which calculated that we have 1,190 subsidies in this country. We have no evaluation of those subsidies. None. Okay? It's a disgrace. And yet we spend billions on it. And the externalities are not taken account in pricing. Okay? For example, we spend £120 million a year on fuel subsidies for industrial fisheries, okay?
Insane.
As a result of which, we have strong data, I've summarized in the book, that it's resulted in overfishing, much more than illegal fishing. It's resulted in highly regressive developments in the industry. It has resulted in more pollution, and it is in conglomeration. And in response to that, we have a situation where ecological crime is treated as a civil offence, not a criminal offence. So the biggest industrial trawler is caught with 632,000 kilos of illegally caught mackerel. We now have a mackerel shortage in this country. It was fined £96,000, the skipper and the owner, and allowed to take the revenue from selling the 632,000, which came to over 400,000. Okay? This is idiotic. Okay? But this is basic, right? So these externalities need to be taken into account. And at the moment, I don't hear it because I listened to the evidence from one of the sessions, and you said, well, the biggest worry is reputational damage for having a story in The Guardian that you haven't been doing this, that, and the other. Okay? Well, that's not good enough. You really have got to put a price on breaking the law.
Well, we've got to stop subsidising in the way that we are.
We've got to stop subsidising. Yeah. Subsidising leads to overfishing, for example, or whatever the other case is. But we don't have an evaluation process.
We're subsidising the polluter, and we're not penalising the...
Yeah. And I'm saying that what I'm hearing from the natural capital lobbying is not getting to that. It's not dealing with the externalities. It's not dealing with deadweight, for example. Deadweight effects are huge with subsidies, but we're not dealing with it.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to conclude this by offering Pernille an opportunity to say something, because we haven't been asking you enough questions. Is there anything you'd like to add? You don't have to.
No, I was just thinking about trying to be thinking about, this is moving away a bit from this more philosophical discussion, but thinking about what governments can do to improve the opportunities for private capital. And I guess I started touching on it when I said, I guess I have 3-4 recommendations. One is to continue developing BNG and other compliance type systems, because it's good to try them out. We need to monitor them. We need to try this. They can have positive results while being mindful of the mistakes that have been made internationally, learning from those. So I think that's good. But I would then point out the opportunities that lie elsewhere. So in terms of what I earlier called mainstreaming nature into legislation, permitting, licensing, etc., making the private sector think about, if they're not doing that already, how they can integrate nature. And it's not just about transparency, but into their investment processes as well.
We heard in the first panel that the UK is producing the first set of standards, or principal standards. We've heard that the biodiversity net gain is the first legislation to have mandatory natural capital. When you look around the world, as you do, perhaps more than, I don't want to denigrate the other panellists, because I'm sure you all look internationally, but you do particularly, are there any other things that the UK is not doing that other countries are doing that we should be doing to facilitate this opportunity?
I don't think, unfortunately, any countries that are doing very well in this respect these days. The US and Australia have traditionally been experimenting most with markets, nature markets, and I think the UK is already looking at what they're doing, so learning from them. I would say the whole world has to start spending more money also from public coffers. The government has money to spend on things that they want to spend it on, and maybe it's time to give nature more priority, a high priority.
Okay, thank you. We've got a final comment from Peter Bachmann.
A request for stability now. Yeah, I think we've got a great platform in the Environment Act. Let's keep it going. Let's actually give it the chance to flourish, and I think it will ultimately create some great impact for nature in this country.
Thank you. Well, that concludes the panel. I'd like to thank Peter Bachmann, Professor David Hill, Dr. Pernille Holtedahl, and Professor Guy Standing for joining us today. It's been a very interesting discussion. Order. Thank you very much. Thank you.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.